Alara inherited the silence first. It arrived the day Liam's breathing ceased, a profound and heavy stillness that settled over their small, rented house in the valley town, absorbing the familiar sounds of his shuffling feet, his low hum as he mended tools, the soft rasp of his cough in the evenings. The silence was an entity, a physical presence that pushed the air from her lungs and replaced it with a cold, hollow ache. After the silence came the letters, thin paper envelopes that carried the weight of tombstones. They spoke in a language of ledgers and liabilities, a cold arithmetic of debt that methodically dismantled the life they had built. The house was not theirs, the tools were not theirs. The meager savings had been consumed by the long, slow erosion of Liam's illness. What was left after the final accounting was next to nothing. And a deed. The deed was for a place she had almost forgotten, a high-altitude line cabin Liam had acquired years ago in a trade for work he had done. It was a relic from an older time, a small, square structure of rough-hewn pine logs, chinked with mud and moss, perched on a stony ledge 2 miles up the North Ridge, where the wind never seemed to stop its relentless scouring of the landscape. No one in town considered it an asset. It was a liability, a place too remote to be useful, too exposed to be habitable, too poorly constructed to withstand the region's notoriously brutal winters. It was, as the lawyer had put it, with a dismissive wave of his hand, unimproved property of negligible value. To Alara, it was the only thing on earth that bore her name, a final, forgotten gift from her husband. It was the only roof left in the world that she had a right to stand under. Her decision to move there was not born of courage or defiance, but of a quiet, desperate necessity. Her brother-in-law, Thomas, a good man bound by the rigid confines of convention, had offered her a room in his home. It was a kind offer, but she could see the pity in his eyes, and in the eyes of his wife, a silent calculation of the burden she would become. She would be the town widow, a figure of sorrowful charity, her life shrinking to the dimensions of a guest bedroom and a seat at someone else's table. The thought was more suffocating than the silence, so she packed what little she could carry, a few books, Liam's sharpest axe, a cast-iron pot, a tin of tea, and a threadbare quilt, and began the long walk up the ridge, away from the pity and the suffocating kindness of the valley. The cabin was worse than she remembered. It stood like a gnarled, arthritic knuckle on the hand of the mountain. The wind, a constant predatory thing, had worried at it for years, pulling threads of moss from the chinking and leaving thin, whistling gaps between the logs. The roof, made of split cedar shakes, was a patchwork of silvered wood and dark, ominous stains where moisture had seeped in. Inside, it smelled of dust, mice, and the deep, resinous ghost of 1,000 long-dead fires. The floor was packed earth, cold and unforgiving. A single grimy window pane stared out at a panorama of granite peaks and a sky the color of old pewter. It was a place on the edge of ruin, a structure arguing with the wind and slowly losing the debate. The house was a reflection of her own life, stripped bare, exposed, and fighting a battle against inevitable collapse. She spent the first weeks in a daze of grief and labor. She patched the roof with fresh cedar boughs, a temporary fix at best. She re-chinked the walls with a mixture of clay she dug from a nearby stream bank and dried grasses, her fingers raw and stiff from the cold mud. She swept the packed earth floor and repaired the stone hearth, her movements slow and methodical. The physical work was a balm, a simple, repetitive motion that quieted the storm of thoughts in her mind. Each sealed crack was a small victory against the encroaching cold. Each log split for the fire, a tiny rebellion against the coming darkness. The mountain was an unforgiving landlord, and the rent was constant vigilance. The people from the valley did not forget her. They saw the faint plume of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney as a sign of folly, not resilience. Thomas made the trek up twice, his face etched with a mixture of concern and exasperation. "Alara, this is madness," he said, his voice firm but not unkind as he surveyed the primitive conditions. "The first real snow will bury this place. The wind will tear it apart. Come down before it's too late, for Liam's memory, if not for yourself." She would simply shake her head, her hands busy stuffing a new handful of chinking into a gap. "I am fine, Thomas. I have work to do." He didn't understand. To him, this was a stubborn refusal to accept reality. To her, it was the only reality she had left. He saw a dilapidated shack. She saw a fortress, however fragile, of her own making. The second time he came, he brought Silas Blackwood with him. Blackwood was the town's unofficial patriarch, the owner of the general store and the holder of most local debts. He was a man whose practicality was so absolute it left no room for imagination or empathy. He viewed Alara's presence on the ridge as an untidy loose end, a potential problem that he would eventually be called upon to solve. Blackwood didn't bother with pleasantries. He stood in the doorway, his large frame blocking the light, his gaze sweeping over the cabin's interior with open contempt. "Woman," he began, his voice a low rumble, "this is a dangerous game you're playing. When the winter comes and you get into trouble, who do you think is going to risk their neck to come up here and rescue you? It will be us. You're making your problem into the town's problem." "I will not be a problem," Alara said, her voice quiet but steady. Blackwood let out a short, humorless laugh. "You already are. You're a widow with no resources, living in a ruin. You're the definition of a problem waiting to happen. Sell this pile of logs for scrap and let Thomas take care of you. It's the sensible thing to do." The word sensible struck a dissonant chord. It was the word everyone used to describe a world that no longer made sense to her. It was sensible to sell, to leave, to become a dependent. It was sensible to surrender. She looked past Blackwood, at the jagged line of the distant peaks, at the way the wind bent the tough, ancient pines that clung to the slopes. They did not break, they yielded, they adapted, they grew in the shape the wind dictated, they survived. In that moment, a quiet, unshakable resolve settled in her heart. This place was hers. This struggle was hers. She would not be sensible. She would be resilient. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "But I am staying." Blackwood's face hardened. He saw her not as a person, but as an error in his well-ordered world. He turned to Thomas. "I wash my hands of this. When she comes begging for help in the middle of a blizzard, remember this day. Remember she was warned." With that, he turned and strode away, his heavy boots crunching on the gravelly soil. A man leaving a problem to fester, confident in its eventual disastrous outcome. Thomas lingered for a moment, his expression torn. "He's a hard man, Alara, but he's not wrong about the winter. It's different up here. It's not a season. It's a siege." "I know," she replied softly, and she did. She knew better than any of them. For weeks, she had been doing more than just patching the cabin. She had been observing. She watched the way the wind moved, not as a chaotic force, but as a river of air with predictable currents and eddies. She saw how it scoured the exposed faces of rock, but deposited deep, insulating drifts of snow in the lees of boulders and ridges. She spent hours just watching, feeling the subtle shifts in temperature, noting the patterns of the clouds, reading the land not as a landscape, but as a text. Her most profound observation came from the memory of a book. Years ago, Liam had brought home a dusty, leather-bound volume from an estate sale, filled with accounts of Arctic explorers and studies of the Inuit people. While Liam had been interested in the adventures, Elara had been fascinated by the quiet details of their survival. She remembered reading about the concept of the igloot, not just the domed snow house, but the principle behind it. The book explained that compacted snow was one of the world's greatest insulators. It was not the enemy of warmth, it was its potential vessel. A wall of snow did not just block the wind, its millions of tiny trapped air pockets slowed the transfer of heat to a crawl. The Inuit did not fight the winter, they built their homes from its very substance. The idea, when it first surfaced, seemed as mad to her as it would to Silas Blackwood, but it lingered, growing from a fanciful notion into a concrete plan. The cabin's weakness was its direct exposure to the wind. The wind didn't just carry cold, it actively stole heat, stripping it from the logs with a relentless physical force. A conventional woodshed or a fence would be torn to shreds. But what if she didn't build a barrier against the snow? What if she built a barrier of snow? Her plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would construct a massive, freestanding wall of packed snow, enclosing the entire cabin. It would not be a mere drift fence, but a solid, thick fortification, standing several feet away from the cabin's own walls. This would create a sheltered courtyard, a pocket of still air, a buffer zone where the wind could not reach. The howling gales could batter the outside of her snow fortress, but the cabin itself would sit in a profound calm. The snow wall would insulate the space, and the cabin's own meager heat loss would be trapped within this secondary enclosure, raising the ambient temperature of the courtyard by precious, life-saving degrees. She was going to build a house around her house, using the very element that threatened to destroy her. The work began in late autumn, as the first significant snows began to fall. She did not have the tools to cut perfect blocks like the Inuit in her book, so she improvised. She built shallow wooden frames, like oversized brick molds, from scrap lumber Liam had left behind. Her process was painstaking and laborious. She would fill the frames with snow, stomp it down with her boots until it was densely compacted, and then use a bucket of water hauled from the half-frozen stream to lightly spray the surface. The water would freeze almost instantly, a process the book called sintering, binding the snow crystals together into a solid, ice-bonded block that was surprisingly strong. Each block was a dead weight of frozen water and air. Lifting them into place was a trial of endurance. Her back ached with a fire that never quite went out. Her hands, even inside thick wool mittens, were perpetually numb, the skin cracking at the knuckles. She worked from dawn until the last pale light faded from the sky, her world shrinking to the repetitive cycle of shovel, pack, lift, and place. The wall grew with agonizing slowness, a white serpent coiling itself around her small domain. The valley watched her progress with a mixture of amusement and morbid curiosity. Hunters passing on the ridge would stop and stare, shaking their heads before moving on. The stories that trickled down into the town grew more and more fanciful. They called her the Snow Queen, a lonely witch building an ice palace. Children whispered she was hollowing out the mountain like a mole. The mockery was a constant low hum in the background of her life, but it felt distant, irrelevant. The wall was all that mattered. The cold, the exhaustion, the sheer physical reality of her labor, these were her only companions. Thomas came again, this time alone. He found her halfway through the construction, her face smudged with soot from the fire and chapped raw by the wind. She was wrestling a heavy snow block onto the top course of the wall, which now stood higher than her head. He watched her for a full minute, his expression unreadable. He was a carpenter, a man who understood structure and form. What he saw was not the random piling of a madwoman. He saw courses level and true. He saw interlocking corners. He saw design. It was absurd. It was made of frozen water, but it was undeniably a structure. "What in God's name are you building, Alara?" he asked, his voice softer than before, stripped of its earlier condescension. "A windbreak," she said, panting, not pausing in her work. She settled the block into place, using a handful of wet slush as mortar. "This is more than a windbreak. This is a fortress." "The wind is a worthy enemy," she replied. "It requires a worthy defense." He didn't argue this time. He didn't tell her to stop. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the wall, his practiced eye taking in the angles, the thickness, the sheer mass of it. He ran a gloved hand over the surface of a block, feeling its surprising solidity. He still thought she was chasing a ghost, that the entire structure would melt or collapse into a useless heap. But he could no longer dismiss the effort. The sheer, bloody-minded determination etched into every inch of it. Before he left, he set a bundle down on the cabin's small porch. Inside was a newer, sharper crosscut saw and a large parcel of dried venison. He said nothing about it, just a gruff, "Don't work yourself to death," before turning and heading back down the trail. It was not an endorsement, but it was a concession. It was the first crack in the wall of his skepticism. By the time the deep cold of midwinter set in, the wall was complete. It stood 10 feet high and nearly 6 feet thick at its base, a formidable, gleaming white rampart that encircled her cabin completely, leaving only a narrow, baffled entrance on the leeward side. The change was immediate and profound. Inside the courtyard, the world fell silent. The relentless, screaming howl of the wind was reduced to a distant, muffled roar like the sound of a faraway ocean. The air, while still cold, was utterly still. Snow fell gently into the enclosure, instead of blasting past in a horizontal fury. For the first time since her arrival, Alara felt a sense of peace, of security. She had not conquered the mountain, but she had negotiated a truce. Her small island of calm was a testament to a forgotten kind of wisdom, a knowledge that came not from fighting nature, but from listening to it. Life inside the snow walls settled into a quiet rhythm. The cabin was easier to heat. A small, efficient fire could now keep the single room at a tolerable temperature, whereas before a roaring blaze had barely held the biting cold at bay. Her firewood consumption dropped by more than half. The trapped air in the courtyard acted as a massive, invisible blanket. On sunny days, the solar radiation warming the dark logs of the cabin was held within the enclosure, and she could often work outside in the courtyard without even a heavy coat. She had created her own microclimate. The valley, however, remained unconvinced. Her fortress was seen as her tomb. "Wait for the white wolf," Silas Blackwood was fond of saying at the general store, referring to the legendary blizzards that swept through the region once or twice a decade. "That's what'll test her little snow castle. The wind will peel it apart like an orange, and the snow will bury her so deep we won't find the body till spring thaw." His pronouncements were met with solemn, knowing nods. It was the conventional wisdom, the voice of experience, and no one had any reason to doubt it. Then the sky began to change. For 3 days, a strange yellowish light bathed the peaks, and the air grew unnaturally still and heavy. The old-timers in the valley sniffed the air and looked to the mountains, their faces grim. They recognized the signs. The white wolf was coming. Weather reports crackled over the radio, speaking of an Arctic clipper of unprecedented scale, a storm of the generation. The warnings were stark. Do not travel, secure your livestock, prepare for power outages and days of isolation. This was not just a snowstorm, it was a meteorological siege. Alara felt a tremor of fear, but it was overshadowed by a strange sense of calm. This was the moment. This was the test for which she had been preparing all these months. She spent the day before the storm's arrival making her final preparations. She brought the last of her split firewood into the cabin. stacking it high against the wall. She melted snow for a large reserve of water. She cooked a large pot of venison stew, filling the small space with its rich, savory scent. As the first flakes of snow, hard and granular like sand, began to fall, she retreated into her home, bolted the heavy wooden door, and sat by the fire listening. The storm did not arrive. It descended. It came not as a gradual increase in wind and snow, but as a sudden, violent impact, as if the mountain itself had been dropped from the sky. The wind struck the outer wall of her snow fortress with the force of a physical blow. A deep, resonant boom echoed through the structure, the sound of millions of ice crystals being compacted under immense pressure. Then came the howl, a sound so immense and multifaceted it seemed to contain the voices of 1,000 screaming demons. It was a sound of pure elemental fury, a noise designed to inspire terror. Outside her snow wall, the world ceased to exist. It was a maelstrom of white, a universe of wind and ice, moving at hurricane speeds. The temperature plummeted to depths that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The wind, armed with ice particles, became a sandblaster, stripping bark from trees and scouring paint from the valley homes below. It was a force that broke things, a power that sought out weakness and exploited it with brutal efficiency. But inside Alara's courtyard, the silence held. The demonic howl was a dull bass roar, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. The air remained perfectly still. Snow swirled down gently, piling in soft, silent drifts. She looked out her single window into the small, protected space and saw a scene of impossible serenity. The contrast was so profound it felt like a miracle. Her wall was holding. The principle was sound. The knowledge from the old book was true. She stoked the fire, sipped her hot tea, and listened to the symphony of the storm, not with fear, but with a deep, abiding sense of vindication. For 2 days and 2 nights, the blizzard raged without pause. The world was reduced to the warm glow of her fire, the pages of her book, and the distant, muffled fury outside. She was secure. She was warm. She was safe. She thought of the people in the valley, in their sturdy, sensible houses, and hoped they were weathering the storm. She thought of Thomas and his family, and of Silas Blackwood in his large, well-built home behind the store. They were surely right to be confident in their modern construction, their proven methods. Her way was an anomaly, an experiment born of desperation. It was on the 3rd night, during what felt like the storm's most violent peak, that she heard it. A new sound piercing the dull roar of the wind. It was a frantic, desperate banging not at the snow wall, but directly on her cabin door. The sound was impossible. No one could be out in this. No one could have possibly reached her. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and unbolted the door, cracking it open just enough to see. A figure stood there, caked in snow from head to toe, a human-shaped drift, barely recognizable. The wind from the courtyard swirled into the cabin, carrying with it a blast of cold air, but it was a gentle breeze compared to the hurricane raging just a few feet away. "Alara!" The voice was hoarse, broken, almost lost in the storm. "For God's sake, help us!" She pulled the door wide open. It was Thomas. But the man who stumbled inside was not her confident, pragmatic brother-in-law. This was a man broken by the storm, his face a mask of frozen terror. Behind him, his wife, Sarah, huddled, clutching their 2 small children, their faces blue with cold. "The roof," Thomas stammered, his body racked with shivers. The woodshed roof, a drift collapsed it, took out the back wall of the house. The windows blew in. The wind, it's like a knife. We couldn't keep the fire lit. We were freezing to death. Alara moved without a word, pulling them inside, shutting the door against the storm. She stripped the frozen coats from the children, wrapping them in her own quilt by the fire. She gave Sarah a steaming mug of tea, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. Thomas stood in the middle of the small room, his eyes wide, taking in the impossible scene. The calm, the warmth, the quiet. He could hear the storm that had just tried to kill him and his family, but it was a distant, impotent thing. He looked from the sturdy, heat-radiating stove to the peacefully sleeping cat curled on a rag rug. He looked at the window where he could see the serene, protected space within the snow walls. He had come here as a last, desperate gamble, expecting to find Alara frozen or on the brink of death herself. Instead, he had found a sanctuary. How? He whispered, the single word encompassing a universe of disbelief and awe. The wind, it should have torn this place to splinters. Alara looked at him, her expression not triumphant but filled with a profound, weary sadness for what he had endured. It never touched the walls, she said simply. It couldn't get past the snow. The full weight of it landed on him then. The madness, the folly, the thing they had all mocked and pitied had worked. It had not just worked. It had triumphed where his own sensible, well-built home had failed. He, the practical man, the carpenter, had been saved by the one thing he had been certain was an act of suicidal insanity. He sank onto a small wooden stool, the strength finally leaving his legs, and buried his face in his hands. The sound of his quiet, shuddering sobs was the only sound in the room, a counterpoint to the distant, defeated roar of the storm. The deal was done. The skeptic had been converted not by argument, but by the undeniable truth of survival. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the silence it left behind was even more profound than the one that had followed Liam's death. It was the silence of a world remade, buried under a dozen feet of snow. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun on the fresh snow was blinding. When Alara and Thomas finally managed to tunnel their way out of the baffled entrance of her snow wall, the scene that greeted them was one of utter devastation. The valley below looked like it had been scoured by a glacier. Mighty pines were snapped in half like twigs. The roofs of several barns had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and as they later learned, the great plate-glass window of Silas Blackwood's general store had shattered, allowing the storm to gut the building, ruining most of his stock and burying the rest in a deep, frozen drift. His house, while intact, had suffered significant damage to its roof, and he had lost a small fortune. But Alara's cabin, nestled within its pristine white fortress, was untouched. It was an island of perfect order in a sea of chaos. The news of how she had sheltered Thomas and his family, saving their lives in her ridiculous snow castle, spread through the valley faster than a spring thaw. The first people to make their way up the ridge were not rescuers, but witnesses. They came to see the impossible structure with their own eyes. They stood in silence, looking at the massive, sculpted walls, at the peaceful courtyard within, and at the small, shabby cabin that had weathered the storm better than any other structure in the county. The mockery was gone, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. They no longer called her the Snow Queen or the Mole Woman. They didn't know what to call her. She was a puzzle they could not solve. Silas Blackwood never came up the ridge again. He never spoke her name, but his defeat was total and public. He had placed his faith in the solid, sensible world of commerce and convention, and the storm had bankrupted him. Alara had placed her faith in a whisper of forgotten knowledge, in the insulating power of frozen air, and she had emerged not just unscathed, but victorious. The following autumn, as the first chills began to snake down from the peaks, a new kind of visitor came to her door. It was Thomas, and with him were 2 other men from the valley. They carried not pity or warnings, but tools and questions. "Show us," Thomas said, his voice stripped of all its former authority, replaced now with the humility of a student. "Show us how you built it." And so she did. She taught them how to make the forms, how to find the best snow, how to pack it, and how to use the water to bind it. Thomas, with his carpenter's mind, saw ways to improve the process, designing better, more efficient molds and a lever system for lifting the heavier blocks. That winter, 3 other homes in the valley were protected by thick, white walls of snow. The Alara Wall, as it came to be known, was no longer an act of madness. It was a new piece of local wisdom born from desperation and observation. Years passed. Alara never left the mountain. The cabin remained her fortress and her sanctuary. She never grew rich. She never sought acclaim, but she was never again vulnerable. She found a security that money could not buy, a wealth measured in warmth, safety, and the deep, quiet satisfaction of understanding. The walls went up every autumn, a seasonal ritual that transformed the landscape and the community's relationship with the winter. They learned, as she had, that the storm was not an enemy to be defeated, but a force to be understood, its own immense power borrowed and turned into a shield. The story of the widow and her wall of snow became a part of the valley's mythology, a lesson passed down from one generation to the next. It served as a reminder that the most valuable knowledge is not always the loudest or the most obvious. It often comes as a whisper from the pages of a forgotten book, from the patient observation of a natural pattern, or from the stubborn heart of someone who refuses to accept the limits of a sensible world. It was a story about the profound, often overlooked power of seeing things differently, of looking at a pile of worthless logs and seeing a home, of looking at a deadly blizzard and seeing a quarry of building materials. The greatest strength, the story taught, was not in the wall itself, but in the courage to imagine it in the first place. Her wall was not built to keep the winter out. It was built of the winter itself. And in that simple, elegant truth, she had found a way not just to survive, but to endure.